In this exercise, we'll take a deeper dive into the jQuery function that we've been using. This function returns a special JavaScript object whose methods we've been invoking in previous exercises. However, the object also contains an array of DOM elements in the order in which they're created within our web page. So this array is known as the wrapped set. And in this exercise, we're going to take that understanding of this wrapped set that we now have and use it to count the objects that have been returned by the selector that we pass into the jQuery function. If you view this web page in the browser, you'll see that it consists of an unordered list here with fruit items. So we're going to use our new knowledge of the jQuery function and the fact that it does return this DOM, an array of the elements in the DOM, and count the methods that we pass to it. I've opened up exercise_1 from the Chapter 4 Working with Wrapped Sets directory. Let's take a look at a few things, including the div that contains the list of fruit. So it's right here, this div whose ID is fruit list. And it also contains a paragraph up at the top that currently reads the number of fruits listed followed by a semicolon. So our job will be to use a method of the jQuery function called size that will return the number of DOM elements used by the selector. So the first thing we'll do is underneath the step 1 comment, you'll see we've already got a jQuery ready method. We'll create a variable to store this quantity of li tags that we're going to grab. So we're going to call it the fruits list size. That'll be the name of our variable. And when we assign the value of that variable, we'll use the jQuery method, standard quotes for the selector. Now, the selector is a div whose ID is fruit list. However, what we want to count are the li children of that fruit list. So once again, if you scroll back down here, you'll see there's the ID of the div called fruit list, and there are the li tags that we want to count. So the method of the jQuery object that we want to invoke here is called the size method. So now that we've got this variable that has the length of li tags, or the number of li tags in this context, we want to go ahead and display that inside of this p tag right here. So again, we're going to invoke the jQuery method and pass to it the selector that we want to manipulate with more jQuery code, and that is the first instance of a p tag. So that's our selector. The method that will place text inside of this p tag that we've just queried or located is the text method. We'll go ahead and add our terminator there, and then we'll write the text that we want. So we want to display the string number of fruits listed, colon, and then we're going to go ahead and concatenate that with the variable that we declared above, fruits list size. If you preview this in the browser, you should now see number of fruits listed is 35. Now we'll go one step further, and we'll deal with this second paragraph where we'll want to indicate the number of fruits listed without including the berries. So if you scroll back to that list, you'll see there's a nested list here. So inside of our first UL tag, we have LIs for apples, apricots, bananas, cherries, grapefruits, and so forth. But this first nested list is for berries, and we don't want to count these LI tags. So our first bit of jQuery counted all of the li tags that were descendants of that div. Now we want to calculate only those that are not berries. So underneath the comment for step 5, let's create another variable to store this information, and we'll call this variable fruit list not berries size. So the key here is going to be the selector that we pass. We still want to invoke the size method of the jQuery object to return the size of the selector's elements. Now the selector's elements is where it gets a little bit tricky. We are still inside of a div called fruit list, and we still want to count descendants of that fruit list that are li tags. However, what we want to exclude is going to be placed inside of this not function. What we pass here is the elements within the current context, which is the fruit list, that we don't want to count. And that is li tags that are children of ul. So that would be those in the nested list. So here's the li that are children of ul that we don't want to count. We're still invoking the size method here though. Okay, so we'll just need to make sure that we quote that value and place the closing quote right here before we go ahead and invoke the size method. Now once again, we want to display that variable within the page. So we invoke some more jQuery here, quote the selector, which is the p tag. This time we're passing in the index number, which is 1, our first paragraph. Because we are grabbing the p tag with this equals function, this function expects an index number, so we are using zero-based counting here. So the index number of the first paragraph here would be 0, and the second one would be 1. So we're passing in the index number 1 to the equal method. Then we'll go ahead and invoke the text method because we're trying to assign some text here, and that's going to read the number of fruits listed, not including berries. And we'll go ahead and concatenate that with the value of our variable. If you preview this in the browser, the value that it gets calculated should be 24. But our little indication of what we're counting here says not including berries. But what we're really not including is any nested li tags which are inside of ul tags. So that includes a bit more than berries because there's more nested lists here. Cantaloupe, honeydew, the melon section, and the mixed fruit section. So you might want to modify that to say not including berries, or melons, or mixed fruit. In this exercise, you learned a bit more about the jQuery object and the fact that it returns this array of DOM elements. In particular, we learned how to count the items that we're passing in by way of the selector. In this exercise, you'll learn how you can use the techniques we've been using so far, which is to invoke the jQuery method, pass in a selector that we now know returns an array of these elements, and then perform some sort of action on the selected items or elements. Then add to that list another set of elements and perform a different action. So this prevents you from having to write more jQuery to make the first selection and perform some sort of action, go back and make the second selection and make some sort of different action. So we're basically making a chain of elements that we'd like returned to us by the jQuery method. I've opened up exercise_1.html, and I'm going to, underneath the existing calls to the jQuery method, call the jQuery method again, and I'll be returning li tags whose parent is a ul tag. So before we go ahead and invoke the dot and invoke some sort of action, let's take a closer look at what this selector is going to return for us. So it is li elements that are children of ul. So if we look at our list of fruits, we shouldn't expect this jQuery selector to return apples, apricots, bananas, and so forth, because they are li tags, but their parent is not a ul tag, which is exactly what we're specifying. The parent of apples, apricots, bananas, and berries is this div tag. What we will get from this selector, however, are these li tags, strawberries, blueberries, and raspberries, whose parent is an li tag called berries. We'll also get these li's because their parent is also a ul element, and the same here. So now that we know what we're selecting, let's add the method that we'd like to invoke. And this method is called addClass, to which you pass a CSS class, and ours is called _fruit. So we have a CSS block here at the top with a couple of class selectors, make italic, which simply sets the font style to italic, and _fruit, which we just invoked, which underlines using the text decoration property. So the addClass method specifies a CSS class to add to the items we've selected in the jQuery selector. In addition to the li tags that are children of ul, we can use the add method and add another selector. We still have to quote it, and in this case it's going to be the fruit list. That's the div that you see here, whose ID is fruit list, and its li children. So we've modified our selector to add these elements, and then we'll revisit add class and perform a different action here. We'll add the class make italic to the new selector. So when you save this file and preview it in the browser, you should see a number of style changes here. First, the li tags that were children of ul were underlined. Then we added to that initial selection with the add method all of the li children of the fruit list, and we invoked a CSS style called make italic. So all of the li children, including those in the initial selector, are now italic. So this is a result of a jQuery method called add, which adds a new selector to the existing selector. Very often what a developer would like to do is perform an action repeatedly over the items in the wrapped set that was returned by the jQuery method. jQuery provides a function for this purpose called the eachIterator method. And as you can see from the example here, it accepts a function argument with two parameters. The first one is a zero base index of the element within the set that was returned by the jQuery method. And the second is the element itself. So in this case, we're selecting image tags, and we're basically looping through them with this eachIterator method. And for each image that it finds, we're going to set rather the image's title to this is a picture, and then we'll use the index number. So we have picture 1, picture 2, and so forth. And then we're getting the ID, again with the this scope and the ID property. So for this exercise, which is exercise 3, we're going to loop through each grain on this list. So this is a unordered list, and that's the return set that will come back from our jQuery selector. And then we'll pop up an alert box for each item that it finds in this set, and it will just tell us whether this is a whole grain or a refined grain. So after you've opened up exercise 3, let's scroll down to that unordered list. You'll see it's in a div tag called fruit list, and each li tag has a class property, and it is that class that's going to tell us whether it's a whole grain or a refined grain. So let's head up to our script block. We've already prepared the script block and the document.ready function, so you can place your cursor after step 1. And as we typically do, we start by calling the jQuery function. Now we know we want to implement the each, and that we'll need to pass to this function, which is the argument to the each call, the index and the element. But first we'll need to put our selector in there. So we're going to loop through li tags in this document object model of this page, because those are the only, this is rather the only list in the page. So we can use the li as our selector. Now we'll need to pass in the index number, and we could pass in the element, but that's an optional argument, so we're not going to pass that in. We are, however, going to indicate what action we'd like to take for each li tag found in the document, and that's going to be an alert pop-up. So we'll use our jQuery method to grab this being the element that we're currently looping through. In other words, the li tag that the each is currently iterating through. And we'll go ahead and set the text. and we're going to concatenate that with a space bar and is a concatenated with the class name, because the class name is what's going to tell us whether this is a whole grain or a refined grain. So once again, this being the li element that we're currently looping through, and we want its class name property, and we'll just concatenate that with a period to end the sentence. So you should be able to save this and test it in your browser, which would result in the pop-up box with the first item on the list being displayed, and that's a whole grain, and as long as I OK this, the second box will continue to show up behind it in the order in which these items are listed here. So you can see it's actually looped through each one of these. So in this exercise, you learned how we can loop through a wrapped set that's returned by jQuery in order to perform a repetitive action on it. In this video, we'll continue working with wrapped sets of elements by working a little bit deeper with elements and attributes. So I've opened up the finished file in the browser so you can see what we're going to accomplish here. We've got a basic header followed by a select list and a graphic. When we go ahead and choose from the combo box, dairy, the graphic changes and we add some additional text in the form of this bulleted list. And although we could continue in this exercise to do all of them, we'll only do dairy and grain. As you can see here, having made the grain selection, we're now looking at a different unordered list and a different graphic. You'll need to open up exercise 4 inside of the chapter 4 working with wrapped sets directory. If you look at the script block at the top, inside of the document.ready function, we declare a variable called dairy, and below that another variable called grains. And each of the two variables are set to an array of simple objects that consist of two name value pairs called serving and measure. And this is the data that we'll access when we dynamically create that unordered list. So take a moment to examine the dairy and grain variables, and then go ahead and place your cursor at line 61. Before we start writing the jQuery, we'll take a look at what it is we want to accomplish and how we might do that. The idea is that the user might change something in the combo box, such as fruit or dairy, etc. And when that change event happens, we want to respond to that event by writing a function that determines what was selected in that combo box. For example, if the selected item is dairy, then we'll swap out the current image for an image of skim milk. Then we'll dynamically create an unordered list that loops through those dairy objects and lists the items in that object. Let's begin by responding to the change event of the combo box. The select element that creates the combo box is called foodgroups_CB. So we need a jQuery selector that will select that element within the DOM and then respond to the change event of that object. We'll start with a call to the jQuery function, and then we'll pass to it the proper selector, which we just saw was a tag whose ID was foodgroups_CB. So now we have our selector. jQuery locates that for us, and then we invoke a method of the jQuery object called change, and we pass to that method a function that determines what will happen when that event is dispatched. So the first thing that we need to do in our method is determine which of the options in the select menu was selected. So we're just going to run a single if block here, and then one more else if, because remember, we're only writing two here. We're just going to write the responses for dairy and grain. So we'll just leave it at these two for now. So the first if block will determine if the option chosen was dairy. So here again, in order to locate that option, that selected option, we'll use a jQuery command. So there's the call to the jQuery method, and we're interested in the selected option of the combo box. And that combo box had an ID of foodgroups_CB. So once again, quotes for the selector, a £sign to denote an ID selector, and it was called foodgroups_CB. So there's the selector, but it's not quite complete because it only gets us to the select box. And what we're interested in is the children, which are the options. So let's take a second look at that. That's the selector for foodgroups_CB, so that gets us here. But we're really interested in these options. So that's why we appended to the food group CB the option tag. But here again, we're not being quite specific enough because we do not want all the options. We only want the option that's selected. The next thing we want to do is, now that the jQuery has queried the document object model and returned to us the selected option of the food groups combo box, we want to see if its text is equal to the string dairy. And that tells us if that is the option that was selected. If dairy was the selected option, then we want to take an image, and that's this image right here, the one whose ID is food groups image. And we want to change the source attribute of that image right here to point to a different graphic. We'll be pointing to a graphic of skim milk. Inside the if block, we'll write a jQuery to get that graphic and reset its source attribute. So first, we need the jQuery to actually get that graphic. So here we are, a standard syntax for the jQuery method. We quote the selector, and that selector will get by ID, so the pound symbol, again, to denote the ID. And it was called food group image. So we have the selector. Now we need a jQuery method that will allow us to set an attribute of this image tag that we've just located with this selector. And that method is called attr. And this method will either retrieve a value of an attribute or it will set the value of an attribute. Many jQuery methods work in this manner. In other words, that's the method attribute, and it will either get or set. So jQuery will determine whether it's a method that should retrieve a value or set a value based on the number of arguments you pass to it. So if you pass to it one argument, it retrieves the value. If you pass to it two arguments, the name and the value, it typically sets the value. What we'll do is a shortcut technique to set the value. Here's the call to the attribute method. And then we'll pass to it the name-value pair indicating the name of the attribute we want to set and the value, and that's done with the curly braces that you see there. So the name of the attribute is source. And the value we want to set is a graphic called skim_sm, and it's a GIF. Now we'll go ahead and dynamically generate that unordered list based on the dairy object up here and the various items within it. Milk, yogurt, pudding, and so forth. So I've terminated the last jQuery statement, and we'll come down a line and create the next one. Now in this case, our selector is going to be this div whose ID is food list. You can see that it's an empty div right now. So we put our selector in there, and don't forget your pound symbol because this is an ID selector. And the command that will generate this unordered list for us is HTML. So this is a jQuery method. You pass an HTML string to it, and it creates that string. So we want to create an unordered list. So we simply type the UL tag that we want here in quotes. Now at this point we could use a loop because we want to create LI tags for each object in that dairy array. So rather than write this code repeatedly, we'll just put it inside of a jQuery loop. So underneath the HTML method you just wrote, we use the $ syntax to access the jQuery method. We then invoke the each method that creates the loop for us. What we want to loop through is the variable dairy, and then we write a function that we want to execute for each element inside that variable dairy. We pass to the function the index number, and in this case our second argument is going to be the serving, and that's the portion that you see here under serving. Serving milk, serving yogurt, and so forth. Next we'll write this function. The goal of this function as it loops through the dairy variable is to add LI or list item tags to the UL tag we created here. So first we have to access the UL tag that we just created so that we can, via jQuery methods, append to that UL tag all the LI tags that are going to be created as a result of this loop. So we need to access the UL tag first, and we do that as we always do with a jQuery command and a selector. And in this case, the selector is the same div food list. But now it has, as a child, UL, and it has that child because we created it right here. Once we've selected that portion of the document, we use a method called append, which will append whatever content we created here we could invoke a function that creates that content for us, or we could literally write what we want to append right inside the append method, and that's what we're going to do here. So we're going to put some string literals here indicating that we would literally like to append to this UL tag an LI tag, and then we're going to take that LI tag and concatenate it with the serving that was passed in here by way of our dairy variable. So this might look a little confusing because we're saying serving.serving, because serving represents our dairy object, but it has a property called serving, just like it has a property called measure. So we're just saying take whatever was passed into here, which we chose to call serving, but we could have called it something different, and we get that object serving property, and we can concatenate that with more string literals followed by serving.measure, the second property, and concatenate that with a closing parenthesis, and we'll close the LI tag that we started here, and we'll terminate the jQuery statement and clean up our closing brackets. To finish up with grains, we'll just do some copying and pasting and modifying the code. Here's the if block that determines if the user has selected dairy. So you can select that and copy it and paste it here inside the else if. Of course, we'll have to modify this because we're not looking for dairy this time. Now we're looking for grain. Next, we'll clean up this closing curly brace because you'll see in a moment that it belongs down here. And we'll go ahead and we'll just copy what we've done here and put it inside the else if block. And again, we'll have to modify this so that it's pointing to grain and not dairy. Starting with line 73, we no longer want a picture of skim milk, but instead we've got a graphic called crackers_SM. And instead of looping through the dairy object, we're looping through the grains object. And finally, we'll make sure our brackets are correct. And now I've added this second one here, and I'll delete any extra line breaks we have. And there as well, and I'll need one more curly brace to close my initial if block here, and this curly brace has actually been satisfied with that line, so we'll clean that up. And the same is true of this curly brace, which has been satisfied here, so we'll remove that one. And close the else if block that we started here. So take a moment to proofread all of that, and then you can save this file and you can go ahead and test it in the browser. Remember, you can only test the dairy and grain options. So here's our initial image, and when we choose dairy, the image swaps out, and due to our jQuery, the bulleted list is created, and you can try grain as well. So we've introduced a number of topics in this video, including the use of objects like dairy and grain, but more importantly, we focused on the fact that the jQuery selectors allow us to once again select elements within the document object model and dynamically act on those elements. In this case, we use if blocks to determine what was selected, and we also learned the attribute method to dynamically create attributes, and we learned how to dynamically generate HTML.